It's 10 times the terror.
Hello and welcome to 10 Times the Terror.
Not okay.
Clear throats. Hello, welcome to 10 Times the Terror. My name is James.
And I'm Paul.
And on today's special episode, Dad, I have to ask you, if you feel an icy cold breath on the back of your neck, maybe it's your grandson playing with your head, or it could be the Invisible Man. Because today's episode, we are talking about the Invisible Man.
All right.
A Universal monster classic. We're going to be talking about both the original 1933 version as well as the recent 2020 version. We're going to maybe compare and contrast the two, kind of talk about the sort of legacy of this character as well as maybe where we see this franchise going forward.
We may want to mention the original novel, which was right at the turn of the century by H.G. Wells.
We could certainly talk about that. And yeah, we're going to get right into it. We're going to be discussing probably both movies at length. So if you haven't seen either one, we definitely recommend going to see them before listening to this episode. So right off the bat, Dad, Invisible Man, just as a property, whether it be the H.G. Wells novel or the film, what is your kind of first introduction to this character?
I think it was seeing the 1933 film on Shock Theater on TV back in the late 50s, early 60s. And that was a fascinating film. I think the special effects still hold up very well for a movie that made so many years ago. And that was my introduction. Then Universal, when it get into what we call the Silver Age, beginning with Son of Frankenstein in 1939, basically launched a whole number of series of monster horror stories, a lot of monster ones too. So the Invisible Man, we talked about that. There was an Invisible Woman, an Invisible Agent. There were several sequels, Invisible Man Returns, as well as there were all those films about Frankenstein and Dracula and the Wolfman. They kept being recycled. They made more films about Sherlock Holmes than any other figure, but the Holmes films also veered under Universal into the horror realm with the Creeper and the Spider Woman and so forth. So when we're looking at the Invisible Man 1933, we have to distinguish that from the plethora of sequels and franchises that came in what we call the Silver Age of horror beginning in 1939. That's just a background. So when you ask, I'm not sure that I saw the Invisible Man first. I might have seen the Invisible Man's Revenge or something. There were so many of them. But this is part of what makes Universal fascinating and why we still watch their films today, because they made a whole number of series. And so the Invisible Man as a single film is one subject. The Invisible Man as a Universal franchise is another subject, if I'm making myself clear on that. And then the new film is a whole other story too.
Yeah, so it sounds like clearly the Invisible Man was a successful property amongst the other well-known ones like Frankenstein or Dracula, giving multiple sequels, which shows that it was one of the kind of Universal monster giants, if you will, amongst all this whole series. But I'd like to go right into that original 1933 one. I mean, it's directed by James Whale, who, as we know, directed Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, The Old Dark House. Stars Claude Rains, so has a big name actor in it. So, Dad, like,
who wasn't known at the time though? He was an unknown.
Who wasn't known at the time, and again, spoilers. We don't really quote unquote see him for a lot of the movie. It is very much a vocal performance, and obviously there was a lot of acting with his mannerisms when he's in clothing, but a lot of it is him as an invisible person. But what do you think makes this film stand out amongst the array of quality films they had at this time in that golden age?
Well, James Whale was an incredibly innovative director, and he can't just be consigned to the horror film genre. His Showboat is one of the best musicals that Hollywood ever produced, with Paul Robeson. Wonderful film. But James Whale has this tremendous way of just putting things off in a funny way. He carries over characters from one film to the next. Una O'Connor is a great example. She's a major supporting character here, and she shows up again in Bride of Frankenstein, playing a very similar kind of hysterical, over-the-top character. The same thing goes on in a number of E. Clive shows up in several of these films with a Cockney accent. So basically, the Invisible Man, as well as the Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, are more than anything else James Whale movies. He's a classic example for me, of an auteur that he fashions everything to his own perspective, his own image. And a lot of what he deals with are the crises within family units, which you wouldn't necessarily think of right away. But if you go back and look, Frankenstein, you've got major family issues. Certainly Bride of Frankenstein. Certainly here, The Invisible Man. Also in Showboat. So Whale has the ability to focus on given topics that may not be immediately obvious. In some way, his topics are invisible to the casual viewer. Aha. Anyway, that would be one thing I would say. But James Whale is a phenomenal artist, and you can just watch these movies over and over again. And they're funny, they're scary, they're exciting, they're very mysterious. There's a couple of plot weaknesses in them, but those are minor compared to how well he brings this all across. The whole opening sequence, now again, we're getting into spoiler alerts, but the first time we actually see the Invisible Man being invisible, he's taking off his clothes, unraveling stuff, and he's got a room full of people horrified because it looks like he's just disappearing into thin air. A fabulous sequence, and Claude Rains is tremendous. Again, it's only his voice. Spoiler alert, we do have the convention from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that in death, the monster turns back to his original self. I think it's true of the Wolfman as well. And that's going to be the case here. But the only time we see the Invisible Man is the very end of the film. And we've seen the struggle that's going on between him and his fiancée and his future father-in-law, who is going to show up later on as Clarence in It's a Wonderful Life. So there's a lot to be impressed with here. That just starts it off. But I think the whole idea of somebody invisible stalking you is very unnerving. And that's what Whale plays on a lot here. And in fact, I think he overdoes it at one point when he has the former associate of the Invisible Man, Jack Griffin, former associate Arthur Kemp, tries to escape from him, and it's not a very well carried out plan. I don't have to go into details about that, but it does pick up that archetypal fear. What would it be like if somebody's coming after you and you can't see them? And that's a very significant part of the new version, even though it's not the same plot. It's the same kind of mood, the same kind of principle. And so go ahead, James, you give us your take on this.
Yeah, I think for me, what makes Invisible Man such a fascinating, universal monster in this case is that, obviously the very idea of an invisible person, a threat that you literally cannot see, is inherently very fearful, and there's a lot you can mine from that and create a lot of suspense and tension and terror with. But what I like too, even just kind of contrasting this character with, let's say, Frankenstein or even like Jekyll and Hyde, these other stories about these kind of mad scientists with their experiments gone wrong. With like Frankenstein, for example, you have Dr. Frankenstein, but then the monster is its own entity. It's the Frankenstein monster, as we know, played by Boris Karloff famously. But I think what's great about Invisible Man is that the mad scientist himself is the threat. He is the villain, and the whole idea is that as he becomes invisible, it sort of affects him mentally, where he becomes more deranged and eventually sinister, and becomes this actual threat that he's going out and literally attempting murder and stuff, and successfully murdering people. And so I think that just creates an interesting sort of dichotomy within an already kind of familiar territory for this kind of subject matter. And then I think you're right. James Whale clearly knows how to make a really exciting, suspenseful, entertaining horror film. And I think you're right. He injects a good amount of sort of dark humor throughout. but it never diminishes the suspense he's working with. I do think Claude Rains gives a great performance, especially that you don't actually see him. It's a lot of emoting with his voice and also with his mannerisms when he does have clothes on, and he does become more evil as the film goes on. But you also kind of understand his passion and where he's going for. And I agree. I think some of the plot details developments do get to be a little far fetched. Like you mentioned, the way he goes after Dr. Kemp. They have this whole setup with the police on how they're going to escort him out, and yet he still ends up by himself in a car. Which then, the Invisible Man is behind him, kills him, he falls off a cliff.
And you know that's that whole thing is, it doesn't surprise you. It's overly contrived. Of course, after all this preparation, if he's going to be alone in a car, the Invisible Man's certainly going to be there.
And even, I mean, again, it's these movies are 80 plus years old, but even the way the movie kind of wraps up with how the police sort of like close in on him, it does get to be a little kind of convenient. Whereas like the rest of the movie, the Invisible Man is so far ahead of everyone that they kind of just sort of like narrow in and shoot him, and then that's kind of it. But all that's to say, it's still, I think, a very, again, I think one of the really keynote ones of not just the whole Universal franchise of that era, but specifically of the Golden Age. I think it really holds up well. It is very entertaining, and I think it has a lot of rewatchable value to it.
And I think when we talk about the Golden Age, which I certainly agree with, I think we have to say that the category is not, is it a Frankenstein, Dracula, or whatever. Is it a James Whale film?
Yes.
Because the James Whale stamps his image, his footprint, if you will, on all of the films that he worked on. And they're clearly there. Say Henry Travers, I mentioned before, becomes Clarence in It's a Wonderful Life, is a very sympathetic, hardworking scientist, good scientist. But it's a different character, a different world. And I think James Whale is unquestionably the greatest director of horror films in movie history, and certainly in Hollywood's history. And he really only made 4 of them, but they're all strikingly original. And this one certainly, one of the things that's an interesting convention, you have somebody who's invisible, but he spends much of the movie wearing clothes and bandages. So kind of like, what's the point? If you're going to be invisible, why put all these clothes on to show people where you are and what you are?
Because he's allegedly running around naked when it's the middle of winter,
right.
And not catching a cold,
not even sneezing. So yes, you have to clearly have a voluntary suspension of disbelief in any of these films are fantasies. But think of what that fantasy is. Imagine if you could be invisible for 24 hours. What would that be like? What would you want to do? Where would you want to go? And could you pull it off? Because one of the things that's very exciting about the new one is we have the presence of the Invisible Man behind the heroine, and we know he's there because we can see his breath. Now the heroine can't because she's got her back to him. We see her breath. It's a cold setting, but and again, that would have been something in the James Whale film, because if he's out in the winter without any clothes on, you certainly see his breath. But that is what to me makes an effective horror trope, if you will. The idea that it's not the blood and the gore; it's the surprise of a figure who's working in the background. And it's classically, the audience knows more than the heroine does. You want to yell at the screen, "Watch out behind you!" Of course, we never do, but we may be inclined to do that. But I think that remake, although it's not the actual story, it's the theme, and I think it's very well handled. And there are some really shocking moments when the Invisible Man is totally invisible. But again, he never makes the floor creak when he walks or things like that. You have to accept that, because the fact is, even if you are invisible, there's 100 different ways that your presence becomes known. Again, Paris have thought you have to sneeze.
That's the ultimate. That's the Achilles heel if you're the Invisible Man. You might sneeze. Well, I think on that we can maybe kind of transition to talking about this new Invisible Man, the one that came out in 2020, right before the pandemic hit. But I think before we get fully into that film, we can't acknowledge that without prefacing talking about the attempted and then failed dark universe that Universal attempted. So for those of you that don't know, basically Universal, which has had this whole franchise of monsters for all these years, for the longest period they weren't kind of releasing anything, but then we'd have these kind of random releases. So like for example, we had the Mummy with Brandon Fraser in 1999, which I personally enjoy that one a lot. It's a very fun, almost Indiana Jones type action adventure, but I think that's a fun one with a couple sequels. We did have the Wolfman in 2010 with Benicio del Toro, which I never saw, but you said was
I
pretty
know,
bad.
very bad.
But it seems like, but none of these were really connected, and they were all kind of isolated
Right.
releases.
I think that Wolfman was forgotten very quickly. I don't
Yeah.
think anybody even talks about it anymore.
Exactly. But then we had not too long ago, a few years ago, Universal announced this Dark Universe, which was their, in a way, attempt to not only relaunch a lot of these properties, but make it a shared cinematic universe. Now, obviously, we're living in the Marvel Studios climate where the Marvel Cinematic Universe aren't just successful; they are literally dominating the box office. So I think everyone is trying
with the exception of Batman.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Batman did very well, but obviously Marvel in itself are the biggest movies
Right.
that come out every year. They dominate the box office. So everyone is trying to chase that success, but maybe to limited return, if you will. But so the Dark Universe was announced. They had this whole slate of actors announced. It was like Russell Crowe as Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. They had Johnny Depp. They had Tom Cruise. They announced all these projects. It's going to be this whole big endeavor. And then we got The Mummy in 2017, starring Tom Cruise, which I didn't see. I heard nothing good about. It came and it crashed. It was a box office bomb. I mean, from the trailers, it looked like they were trying to kind of replicate what the Brandon Fraser ones were doing, where it's more of an action adventure movie versus a real horror movie. But it did not do well. It did not perform well. And it seems like that in itself kind of sunk this whole project to begin with. So ever since then, kind of like all these other projects have either been canceled or rumored to be canceled. But it's kind of fascinating that kind of one movie could already kind of sink the ship. But then a couple years later, we get this Invisible Man, which I think initially it was going to be starring Johnny Depp, but then that ended up falling through. And it stars Elizabeth Moss, who we know from Handmaid's Tale and Mad Men. And it's directed by Leigh Whannell, who directed the movie Upgrade, which I thought was a fun kind of almost 80s throwback action movie. But as you alluded to, Dad, this Invisible Man is not the classic H.G. Wells story. It's more taking the idea of the Invisible Man and making it sort of modern, a modern story, not just in terms of technology, but also I think in terms of themes. It's very much a gaslight story about a woman in this abusive relationship who's trying to get out. I think the whole opening scene is really impressively done with the way she's setting up this whole escape in the middle of the night, where she has all the security cameras off and everything, and of course something goes wrong and all the alarms go off, but she gets away with her sister, and not before the boyfriend runs in and like breaks his arm through the window trying to get her. But so we can see right off the bat she's in this very toxic relationship that she is quite literally trying to run away from. And then early on we find out that her boyfriend Adrian, who's played by Oliver Jackson Cohen, who's apparently this high tech scientist, and everything, but that he allegedly commits suicide, and that he like left her all this money and everything. But then immediately Elizabeth Moss, she does not believe any of this to be true, and we see early on as she's staying with one of her friends how she's very kind of on edge. She kind of is looking in corners. She kind of feels his presence even if she can't quite literally see it. And so then we, the audience, as you said, kind of early on understand that there is something going on where we are getting these moments of an invisible force at action. And but in the movie we're to believe that the other characters aren't believing this. So it's very much toying with Elizabeth Moss, where it is this gaslight story of is it all in her head or is it really happening? And he's very much playing with her emotions and her mental state. And again, this is all obviously coming out in a very Me Too climate, so I think a lot of that rings true. And I think what it does really well is it delivers all of the surface thrills you would want out of a horror movie like this. It's very scary, very intense. It has some really great set pieces. I mean, there's the one with the paint on his, at least he throws on him where he's on the stairs. So there's all these technical tricks they play to show that he's there that are really effective. But also, yeah, if you want to dig deeper, I mean, it very much goes into the whole idea of not believing a woman's testimony and false accusation, and how a lack of quote unquote evidence will be used against the victim. And then she eventually retaliates, and I think the whole thing comes together in a very smart, very clever way that I think is a great sort of revamping of a familiar property like this.
But it is, yeah, you should say that classic gaslight idea that nobody believes the woman. And she has all this evidence, but nobody believes her, and that just spirals out of control throughout the course of the whole film. I think the whole idea of the invisibility is not that the person is invisible; it's that they're wearing clothes that make them invisible. That was a major step forward, I thought, because one of the problems in the earlier films is how to account for this. And too often, in sort of some of the later Invisible Man ones, you can see the strings that are holding the gun or whatever other prop is involved.
Well, not just clothes. It's like a high tech suit he created.
Yeah, right.
Which also kind of can maybe excuse away why you wouldn't hear sounds or breathing or etc. Like it's a whole suit that goes over his head and everything. Like something Tony Stark would make.
Deep sea divers or something.
Exactly.
Except for on land. So we talk about the scene in the restaurant.
That scene, my jaw hit the floor. It's like we get the scene where she's going, and again, clearly the boyfriend is not just toying with her, but even like attacking her family, her friends, to the point where yeah, they're all starting to question Elizabeth Moss, whose character is Cecilia. But so then we get a scene where she's in a restaurant, going to meet with her sister, who wants to just kind of explain everything. And as the scene starts, I'm thinking, okay, she's in a public setting, she should be safe, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a little kind of awkward at first with the sister because it's something where the boyfriend tapped in her email and was saying all this very aggressive, harmful things. But then they're having this back and forth talking, and all of a sudden the sister looks at her, and there's a knife hanging in midair right next to her, and it immediately slits the sister's throat and goes right into Elizabeth Moss's hand. And before she can even react, her sister is dead on the table.
People are screaming all around them.
Right. Well, again, everyone looks and they see a knife in her hand. So
yeah,
clearly she killed her sister.
Spurting out of her sister's neck.
And that's where, yeah, the movie to me, it has all these very kind of timely, topical ideas, but it never forgets to be a visceral horror film and really has these scares. And I know you mentioned before the scene where she's standing outside and she breathes, and then we see the breath on the back of her neck, knowing that he's right there. I thought it was very, very well done, and to me, a very just successful way of kind of doing this property in a more, again, where it's more taking the themes versus the actual plot, but I think doing it in a very successful way.
The truth is, for me, as I reflect on it, it owes as much to the Val Lewton films as it does to the Universal ones.
Absolutely.
Certainly in the Val Lewton ones, like Seventh Victim and so forth, you've got the woman who is being followed in ways that seem very incredible, that people know too much about her, and all those kind of fears. And I think that it's as much Val Lewton as it is Universal.
And even early on in the film, where we the audience don't actually see, quote unquote, any of the Invisible Man's actions, we'll have moments where the camera will just kind of linger on like an empty corner, which is like a lot of this like open space, and it'll stay there for a while. And we even are not sure, like, is something there? Is something not there? Should we be paying attention to little details? Like it very much gets you in a very kind of voyeuristic terror of the sort of mental state that Cecilia is in, where she just is looking around at every turn because she thinks someone might be there. And the idea, as we've sort of talked about this whole time, the idea of not just seeing the threat, but of just being watched, of something following you that you can't see. That is a primal fear. And to really kind of dive into that, I think really is like a source of terror.
And at the end of Gaslight, where the woman, the victim, has her, pardon the expression, husband tied up, and at her mercy, she's got a knife. You're really rooting for her at that point, which is the case here as well.
Yeah,
because she's been such a victim and been dismissed by so many people. And the reality is that she's absolutely right.
Well, in effect, she's kind of playing the system to her advantage, because we have this whole scene where, yeah, obviously the Adrian turns out to not be dead, but it's this whole elaborate thing of he was kidnapped, and it so clearly shows that it was orchestrated by not just him, but also by his brother, his lawyer, but also just shows how deeply sociopathic he is and how toxic he is. But we have this whole dinner scene where she's just trying to get him to just confess anything, and he can't do it. And then we have, obviously we can see all the sort of security cameras on display, but we get the knife that opens up and just cuts his throat, and it looks like nothing. And then a couple seconds later, Cecilia comes out and is all terrified. But then we know clearly she put on the suit. But it's also just showing, okay, here is the evidence, the evidence to prove yourself that he commits suicide, and it's kind of her word versus that, and so it shows that she's playing this corrupt game to her advantage. So I thought it was really well. I think both movies are great in different ways, but also just again show how this is a very potent kind of way of tackling horror in a very psychological manner. But it is worth noting that even though this dark universe did not really get off the ground, there are other movies that are in the Universal monster canon that have been announced. We have a Renfield movie that is in post-production that just finished filming. It's supposed to come out next year. It's supposed to be a horror comedy, so we'll see how that goes.
All right. Yeah.
They've also announced a Wolfman movie with Ryan Gosling, and they've also announced a sequel to this, The Invisible Man, which they say could be an Invisible Woman story.
Sure.
And if that's the case, I wonder if they'll kind of also revamp it to be kind of a new take. But I'd be interested. I mean, it seems like they're going to just auteur sort of directors to give their own kind of vision to these different projects.
This whole corpus, if you will, of Universal, it begins with Dracula in 1931 and ends in 1948 with Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, including Dracula. It is still very much with us. These films keep being redone, remastered, put on DVD, not only on DVD, but Blu-ray and high definition. And they're still being shown. They're still on television. They're still on videos. They're going to be with us for a long time because they represent these archetypal fears we've talked about. The Frankenstein theme, that something you're trying to create turns against you. Your best efforts become destructive. What a theme. I mean, that's a theme that covers much of human history.
Well, it seems also, too, just looking at the horror genre in the history of cinema, it seems that for all of the different trends and styles we get throughout of horror and how it evolves and is updated throughout the decades, it seems like these Universal movies are such a foundational benchmark that even as you said, even as we move to different types of horror, we're always kind of coming back to that original ones, whether it be the re-releasing of them or in this case remodernizing them. But it seems like they have such a threshold on the genre that won't ever truly go away, and will always kind of have a true like permanent influence on horror going forward.
And even the minor films work, and that's not. There are many other studios in Hollywood that tried to do horror films, and some of them did them very well, but a lot of them didn't. And the Universal ones, because they made so many, especially when we think of the so-called Silver Age from 1939 to 1948, within the space of a 10-year period, I mean, they must have made 30, 40 films of one kind or another, Ape Woman and all these other kind of crazy things, but they're all worth watching. They all have a certain amount of imagination and perspective, and they're worth seeing.
Yeah, and again, I mean, obviously when you consider the entire trajectory of that original Universal monster run, I mean, how many films we're talking? Like just dozens and dozens, and obviously some vary in quality, but as you said, like they kind of all have something worth noting about them. Okay, well, I think this wraps up today's discussion. Again, I think it's interesting to talk about two films like this where they come out in very different eras, but are drawing from a lot of the same ideas, but just with different kind of executions. But yeah, we'll see kind of where Universal goes next with some of these movies. If we will get a proper new Frankenstein or new Dracula or Wolfman, a lot of this is to be determined. But
yeah, because these themes have been in film throughout cinema history.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's not as though Universal is the only one that made Frankenstein, Dracula, The Mummy, and Wolfman. They've been made by all kinds of different groups, people. Certainly, when you get out of even the English-speaking world, you've got Mexican horror films, you've got Greek horror films, you've got a whole range of other things that you can point to and look at. Italian horror films there's a whole huge area of study there. Black Sunday and the rest of that. So again, horror films deal with the ultimate fears that we have as human beings. They deal with the ultimate issue in life, which is the conflict between good and evil, and it's seen invariably in a spiritual and supernatural way. Sometimes that's done very poorly. Other times it's done very well. And it's worth pursuing because those are the questions that we continually deal with. What about evil? What about the things in the dark? What about things that we're afraid of? What about our own fears and uncertainties? All those things are things that are universal. Pardon the pun.
I would say for me, one of the best recent examples of a Frankenstein type film is Ex Machina. I mean, it's not directly Frankenstein, but it's a futuristic story about creating life through artificial means and that life getting out of your control. I mean, it's the same idea, the same themes.
Yeah.
So yeah, these are very archetypal. Okay, well, yeah, I think that wraps up today's episode. Thank you for having me on, Dad. It's always
great
fun
fun
talking about classic Universal monsters. And yeah, I'm James.
And I'm Paul.
We'll see you guys next time.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to
It's 10 times the terror.
the podcast.
One of my favorite films ever. Let's do that for again.
Thank you for listening to 10 Times the Terror. This podcast would not be possible without listeners like you. You can find out more about our podcast by visiting our website, 10timestheterror.com. That's 10xtheterror.com.